First panel today is about digital identities, and I'm really excited about this because, as you know, my day job is as a very boring lawyer, and I find this sort of stuff so much more interesting. There is a legal angle to this, and we're talking about and how a lot of this can be used practically in KYC and AML, but there are a lot of other actually applications for the sort of technology that we're going to be talking about: digital signatures, digital identities, approved credentials, and so on. So there's a really big tech stack here. There's a really big, I think, and evolving use cases for a lot of these technologies. So the focus, and we had the sort of the ground laid for us yesterday by Sandra. Again, Estonia showing the way here and using this data that Federico mentioned. Using some of this data to help with identity. There are issues, we'll touch on some of these, in using some of this information in the B2B, in the corporate space. And I think we're really at the beginning of what's going to be a very exciting journey. So thank you, you've got the answers up already. So is the cost of KYC AML to your business unnecessarily high? Well, unsurprisingly, nearly 3/4 say yes. I use the word unnecessarily there carefully because it always is high. Many banks do not like the burden of compliance. However, I think we all accept there's a place for regulation, and there's certainly no escape from regulation. So the real issue is, can we lower the cost of this necessary evil, if I put it that way? Maybe that's the wrong word to use, this necessary business requirement. So can I call up my wonderful panel, please? And in a moment, I'll just ask them to introduce themselves. As with all the panels, please do ask questions as we go along using Works Up, and I will have a look at them on my phone. So thank you very much, ladies and gentlemen. So I'll just start with my left. Maybe you can just briefly introduce yourself. Mark, if you could kick off.
Hi, everyone. My name is Ablhad. I work at Dun & Bradstreet, a data company that has been working in the data space for over 180 years. I'm responsible for go-to-market and strategy within risk and compliance. And within risk, we have the supply chain risks and also ESG, which is something we have worked a lot on the past year. My background in this area is that I have worked in the banking industry as a KYC processing officer for many, many years. And looking forward to hearing the discussions here. And
Thank you. Rainer?
Good morning. My name is Osanik. I'm actually a lawyer, but currently working as well in a project in the Ministry of Finance and Economic of Estonia, a project we call KYC Data Exchange Service, that Sandra yesterday presented. And been dealing with this project already for a couple of years, and today I will give you some things why we started it and where we're going to it. But in my real life, I've been working in public sector before for many, many years, and in private sector as well. So I have knowledge and experience from both sides.
Thank you. And Kirsti?
Yes, hello. My name is Kirsti Pent, and I'm a partner at DGS Baltic. It's a leading business law firm in the Baltics. And I head the banking and finance team, work a lot with fintechs and also, of course, traditional financial service providers like banks. So I will try to represent their perspective here. So again, another lawyer on this panel. And
Joao, I don't think you are a lawyer. But,
no, I'm probably the only one who has less attachment to the law. My name is Joao Ray. I'm originally from Portugal, but I've been living in Estonia for the past 15 years. Kind of fell in love with digital identity ecosystem and all the innovation that the country has to show. I'm currently working for a startup, so definitely not 108 years of experience in this field. And the startup is dealing mainly with electronic identities, electronic signatures, and using the existing ecosystem and framework that has been put in place by public and private sector trying to aggregate all of that. Yeah.
Yeah, thanks, Joao. So we're going to talk about that wonderful public-private partnership when we come to RENA. And of course, it was very well demonstrated to us yesterday by Sandra, who ran that video for us. And I think RENA's going to tell us a little bit more about how that works. But it is a much broader subject than just KYC. And actually the tools that we have, even digital signatures, which for many people are simply a substitute for a manuscript signature, are actually really powerful. They can contain so much more information. They can give you so much more in security terms. There's a number of different concepts here around digital identity. So we've got, as I say, digital signatures, and there's 3 types. I'll ask Joao to sort of explain this, but we've got things like verifiable credentials. We've got LEIs, legal entity identifiers, which is a very important initiative and effort to give everybody in the world, every company in the world, an identity in the same way we as private individuals have with a passport. That's very much a registry-based system. We've got DIDs, digital identifiers or decentralized identifiers. So a lot of different things which exist currently, which are evolving. And Joao, can you sort of give us a little bit of a guide to the perplexed here? What are all these things, and where is the most potential, do you think?
Sure. I mean, I think, as you well put it in the beginning of the panel, this is an evolving sector. It's something we're going to see a lot of transformation over the next couple of years, because electronic identities are not something new, as Estonians well know. But I think what has happened over the last couple of years, specifically with the pandemic, was that governments worldwide understood that they need to let people, at least file their taxes while being at home. So they felt the need to give people a means to log into their tax system. And that kind of kickstarted a whole issuing of national electronic identities and made sure that people could do that. So if you look from an electronic identity side and the use cases, this age-old question about in the internet, nobody knows that you're a dog. I think this is still applicable, right? When you're doing business across the world and you don't know who you're doing business with, it is very important to be able to verify whether that company is a legit company, whether the person signing the document is a legit person and is authorized to sign that document. And so electronic identities play a crucial role there. Within the electronic identity field, you also have different levels. So you have things like, your social media profile could be considered a electronic identity. It doesn't give you a lot of assurances because anyone could create that. Even if you have the blue mark on Twitter, it only means that you paid $8 for it. So it doesn't give you a lot of assurance. But then you have at least 2 levels within the European legislation, which are the substantial and the high levels of assurance that do give you some sort of credibility that you're dealing with the right person. And now there's some revision within the eIDs framework about whether we should only focus on the high level or we should keep talking about the substantial, just like we do if you take the parallel to the electronic signature side, when we also have different levels, as you mentioned. You have your simple electronic signature, which could be anything that has an electronic element to it. It could be, again, a copy-paste of an image that you put on a PDF. It could be a scribble on a PDF. It could be simply clicking on a link that comes to your email. So it's still what the majority of the world is doing. And at least from our side, what we believe in is that we believe in the future, the majority of electronic signatures are going to have an identity layer behind. So we're going to be seeing more and more adoption of this electronic identity signatures. And therefore, what our role in all of this is to aggregate the electronic identities already out there and the ways to attach electronic identity signatures to any document. So if you move away from the simple and you go into the proper electronic identities, as we like to call them, then you have the advanced electronic signatures, where there is an element of an identity behind. Yeah. There has been a process of some KYC. And then you have the ultimate one, which is the qualified electronic signatures, which in some cases, and for some of our clients, have been used also in the KYC process. And the reason for that is that you cannot get a qualified electronic signature without having gone through that process of some KYC, in many cases in person, and you're effectively outsourcing some of the liability to the issuer of the qualified electronic signature, be it a government or a private player that is a qualified trust service provider.
Yeah.
So that's a massive opportunity to lower some of the costs that you were talking about, that some of the audience was worried about, because in many cases, like in Estonia, a qualified electronic signature, if you're using some of the APIs, has a cost of only a few cents. So if you can use that in your KYC process, you're massively saving money, because you don't need to do the whole, KYC the old way. Yeah.
It's been done for you, yeah. I mean, this is, and I am very interested in what the audience thinks here. So in the UK, for example, we don't like qualified electronic signatures. And I think that's also the case in Sweden. And I'm talking about we don't like it from a business point of view, from a commercial, from a B2B perspective, because it does have this extra cost. Now, with that extra cost comes the advantage that actually some of the KYC is done for you. There's a high degree of identification, as you say, high degree of trust that you can place in that signature. Part of the reason we don't like it, and I think Sweden and the UK are very mercantilist nations, part of the reason we don't like it is we like things to move very fast. And when you are talking about certainly trading, for example, you don't have time to go to to one of these trust service providers who issue the certificate. Is that something with technology that is getting better? There's a big emphasis in the EU on trust services and approved providers, and that certainly seems to be the way things are going. We touched on a little bit yesterday about the 2020 EU regulation on FTI, on freight transport information. That's what for example, the Port of Tallinn, I don't think Valdo actually said it, but that's the basis, and I know there's certainly some gentlemen here in the room who use that as the basis on which they are building up their services. So this idea of having government-approved providers is certainly very strong in the EU. There's an interesting case in Singapore where, currently, and here I'm going to bring this back into the subject of the panel this afternoon, trade documents. So for trade documents, under the various laws that are being published, you need to have a reliable system. What's a reliable system? One of the ways of showing a system is reliable is having an approved trust provider, an approved service provider. But how do you see this sort of tension between the need to move quickly and fast, move fast and break things? That's what you fintechs say. And the slightly more careful approach. There's pros and cons probably of both, but what's your view? And then I'll ask the panel as well what they think.
Well, I mean, I think here Estonia kind of paved the way a little bit to the case study and how to do these things. Although it is a small nation and therefore maybe some things are easier to implement, you eat that initial cost and you issue everyone with the possibility of having this high level of assurance when it comes to identity and the possibility to have the qualified electronic signature. It is part of the public infrastructure, but once you do that, it becomes part of the national way of doing things. And therefore, the cost per transaction is much lower, and it opens doors to a lot of use cases that weren't there before with the advanced or the simple signature or with a substantial level of assurance. So again, I think the tension is there. I think it's going to be there for the foreseeable future. We need to find the way forward, because if you want compatibility in a worldwide case, if you want compatibility, perhaps you need to sacrifice something. Yeah. You either sacrifice the quality in order to get everyone on board, or you can have this sort of purist view of how it should be and force everyone to it, but then it's going to take a long time. So I think it is an unresolved tension. We see that every day when we're trying to deal with cases, especially outside of Europe. But I think a lot of countries are looking at the eIDs legislation and trying to figure out a way to mimic that behavior. You see more and more countries having this sort of infrastructure. You mentioned Singapore. I mean, SingPass is a very good example of this. UAE, also with the UAE Pass. So a lot of countries are going along that same journey, and you're going to see more of it. So I think in the future, the path is going in that direction.
Yeah, so I think what you're saying is, I mean, there is that tension, of course. But and I guess if we didn't have this, I'll call it burden, I'm trying to use that in a neutral way, the burden of KYC, maybe we wouldn't think so much about, there wouldn't be so much of a pro to having a qualified signature. But there is this requirement. And as you say, it's an upfront investment in a way, in time and a bit of money, to get that very high quality signature that enables you to satisfy some of these requirements. I guess, Raina, you would probably agree with that, wouldn't you? So, and it's something that very much the government has to support. There's a wonderful paper which I gave to the panel, and I recommend it to all of you, by UN CFAC. It's a paper about verifiable credentials, and it talks in there the point that you mentioned about having trusted, trust service providers who are private companies generally, but what they call in here trust anchors. So these are issuers or verifiers of privately issued identities or information. It could be information, for example, about a cargo. It could be the quality, the quantity. If that data is being originated privately, of course, you're going to have some doubts as to whether you can trust it. Having that issued, though, through a government service or a service that's approved by the government is very strong. So, Raina, government has got a big role to play here, and of course, you're leading the way in Estonia on KYC, but it's broader than that. So we heard from Port of Tallinn about the other requirements, but tell me your view.
Just to get from Joao's point and your question as well. First, one thing we lack is a common language in between of countries and inside of a country as well. And the language, I mean the technical language, not the speaking language, is a problem that...
is that language or standards?
Standards. No, let's say standards, yes.
Okay.
Data sets and standards that we are not able to communicate in between each other. So I guess this is the big issue, and this is issue in between countries, and the European Union has been trying to regulate it some way. But as an example of Estonia is far ahead of something, and in one point we are doing something and the rest of the world is doing it differently, because we are like doing something in 5 steps ahead, like the signature. Everybody's using it. And as Sandra was explaining yesterday, by the law it was demanded something to do. As you were telling as well, that in UK, I guess you will never trust the country of giving you the data out of you. You even don't want the country to know everything about you. In Estonia, it has been differently, because the trust has been built in different phases. So it's very hard to climb over these obstacles or walls in between of the countries and to deal, for example, simplifying the KYC as that. So you can't do it as easily in everywhere, but you can try to do it by giving the example that something is working, and maybe when the other country looks at it and saying, okay, if it's working, let's try it. But it won't be easy, that's for sure. Even if European Union regulations, if they regulate something, it still means that it may need to be implemented. And it's a long way to do something. And if you go out from European Union, for example, UK was not the European Union anymore, and if UK is deciding...
Very sadly, yes.
If UK decided that we don't want this one, but they like this one, so we are again in a trouble that EU does it one way, and for example, America, UK, Australia, and rest of the world are doing differently. So again, we have a problem of exchange of information because we speak different data language, so data sets are not agreed in between, and we can't exchange the information electronically. And so we're doing it still in paper, as we did in the last century, as I'm always saying, as my parents did in the last centuries, and we're still doing it if we go cross-border. Inside of a country, we are doing much more electronically, but cross-border, we still collect the stamps and go to a notary to get apostolized documents, and when we go to another company and we keep the documents, they scan it, they enter it manually, they spend a huge amount of man-hours for doing it. Also, it's electronic information, it's available, but we just can't roll it over the borders of the country.
Yeah, And what you and Sandra are saying is, of course, that government has a really important role to play. It's important that you don't over-provide or over-regulate. I think but that you are providing that trust anchor. I think it's a I like that phrase, trust anchor. That you're providing a service that is clearly trustworthy, but also is commercially useful. So, Mark, so you are, I guess, somewhere in between the two. I mean, you in Dun & Bradstreet, you provide some of these services. How do you see the landscape, and what are the challenges and the opportunities? Be positive about it.
Yeah, so we provide different kind of identity number. One of them called DUNS numbers, as an example, very well used worldwide, and other types of IDs. And talking to these customers that are in need of onboarding, suppliers, customers, the importance of identification and verification is the first thing we touch upon when we have these discussions. And as a horror example from when I used to work in the banking industry, identification and verification process could take 3 months until we got enough data and material in our onboarding. So there's definitely a challenge, but that has been much, much better now with everything going on with eIDs and different kind of identity numbers.
Okay, well, can you, because I sort of mentioned it, but we haven't really discussed it. LEIs and legal entity identifiers, does that figure in part of your offering, and what's your view on that? Because this is a vision of the world in which everybody has a number. It sounds a bit totalitarian in a way, but it's I am a name, not a number. But when you're looking at commercial companies, that is really useful. Is that something that figures in? Is that useful for use of a DUNS number? Is a little bit like an LEI?
Yeah. So the
but it's
DUNS
more
number,
than that, isn't it?
Definitely. So DUNS number is a unique number that a company can have, and the number doesn't change at all. Like if it would be acquired by a company, you would still have that DUNS number, and it's unique. LEI numbers is something also we offer, and that's more in the financial industry type of customers that are looking for those numbers. So yeah, different IDs and used to by our customers to demonstrate and audit that they have identified a counterparty in different ways. So yeah.
But yeah, and I guess an LEI, it just tells you that the company exists. I know that the various registries do some background checks on this. I guess it comes back again to this thing about trust anchors. So a government entity is almost by definition very trustworthy. Clearly in Estonia, there's a lot of trust placed, on the government because, as we saw yesterday, it's just such an effective and powerful performer. But Kirsti, do you have a view on this? And how what are the former sort of digital IDs that you see, and what's popular? Let me ask you a legal question. What's problematic about any of these, just from a legal perspective? Is there one that's better than another?
Yeah, from legal perspective, I think that if you're an obliged entity having to apply customer due diligence, AML, KYC, etc., then of course, if we're talking with Estonian institutions, it's very comfortable for them to rely on the qualified e-signatures we have here. But for all the rest types of IDs, it gets very complicated because they are required to take a risk-based approach. So they have to. There's a list of customer due diligence measures you have to apply. We'll discuss them later on, but the level to or the extent to what you require exactly, that's up to the institutions. But I think the challenge for the institutions is that while they may think that or determine what they consider sufficient, what types of IDs, etc. But it may not be. The regulators' view may be different, and the difficulty for the financial institutions, other obliged entities, is that usually they will find out after the fact if they have not done enough. So I think that's the challenge. So I think that's what makes the obliged entities rather conservative in terms of adopting new ways of identifying their customers, unless the state comes in and offers opportunities. But all the rest, I see why they're often conservative.
Yeah, I mean, certainly that is a challenge. I mean, in my job in my bank, we get offered a lot of systems in supply chain, as well as others that say, a lot of providers say, I will do your onboarding for you, I will do your KYC, and the what always comes back from our compliance department, which is not from the legal department in my bank, but we have a huge compliance department, we have a small team of lawyers, but this is not being done to our standard. It's not what I need. I don't know the methodology behind this. How can I really trust this? Goes back again to this point. Where you've got a government behind it, that's one thing. Where you've got a private onboarder, it's different. And Joao,
but I think this is where it's so important to have this network, right? And to have a chain of trust.
Yeah.
And I think
the private trust service providers.
That's it. And I think in that sense, the European Union provides a very good framework for these qualified trust service providers to have a trust chain between themselves. Obviously, there's also private providers in there. So they play a role, but there's a chain of trust between them, right? So if you know that, the level of assurance is high, substantial, you know what to take from there. If you know that they can get a qualified electronic signature, you know what you can get from there. I mean, Adobe also has their Adobe trust list. So you know that if you're getting a signature from one of the Adobe trust list providers, you're somehow sure that it complies to their standards. It might not meet your compliance standards, but if you know that it is part of this EU initiative and the EU trust list, then it should be somewhat, trusted. That element is there. So I think the skepticism is obviously, and the burden is always there for the one who's accepting it. But if it is coming from one of these trusted partners, then it should be beyond. And again, take into account that trust is fundamental. If you're doing business, like I said, across the world, this is where it becomes essential. If I'm doing a multi-million euro deal between, a Swedish company and a Swedish company, I could probably do that with a handshake, right? If I'm doing it between a Swedish company and a Danish company, maybe I'll want something in writing, but you know what? A simple signature is fine. Yeah. If I'm doing it between a Swedish company...
We're all Vikings, yeah.
We're all Vikings here, we all know each other quite well, right? But if I'm doing it between a Swedish company and, I don't want to name countries, but...
Say a French company, because I'm half French, so you won't offend
French company,
anybody.
that's good. I'm not going to offend anyone. And a French company, my trust there is lost a little bit. Yeah. So I want to be sure that I'm actually getting something that is legally binding, that the person signing this is who he claims to be, and that the signature is valid, and I can take it to court, and I don't want to have to DHL back and forth, print, sign, scan. I want to get it done. And if I want to do that, I will need a qualified electronic signature. Yeah. And this is where it becomes important. When you're doing supply chain finance, if you're doing business across the world, this is where the trust element comes, and where there are legal frameworks and providers of this trust that are already deployed. So we don't have to reinvent the wheel. We just have to apply what is already out there, the network of these trust service providers that already exist. The adoption curve is picking up. It hasn't always. It's picking up now.
How big is your list? Because you in your company you aggregate these. Yeah. Compared to a year ago, are there more of these trust service providers?
It's not that there are more trust service providers, but to be honest, it's not that the trust service providers are growing. It's that the adoption of the existing trust service providers is growing. So you don't need more trust service providers. You need them.
Better use of them. Yes.
You need to make their use more widespread by making the usability the onboarding, all of that to be easier. And like I said, the pandemic, for better or worse, the pandemic had a massive effect on this, because suddenly governments understood people are at home, they can't do their taxes, they have to do their taxes online. How do they do it? Well, I guess they need an electronic identity. Let's start pushing this. And the same thing with signatures. Huge, massive influx towards things like DocuSign. And now the market is maturing and understanding that there is a difference between just a scribble on a PDF and actually a signature where I can prove and attach someone's identity to that signature. So, again, we believe in the future the majority of signatures are going to have this identity element to it.
Yeah, I mean, I think you made a really good point about trust, but, sort of the cultural idea of trust. I listened into a DocuSign webinar a couple of weeks ago in the UK. So it was all they're nearly all UK lawyers. And it was, qualified electronic signatures, we just want simple here. That's enough for us. I think maybe we are missing the bigger picture in the UK, and I think that's definitely the way that the trend is going. But I think what's also really important is this idea of trust. At the end of last year's edition of this summit, we ended up with a very philosophical question of trust or proof.
Yeah.
So proof is sort of legal proof. So Kirsti, if you say that it's enough to use this, it's a safe harbor, as the Americans would say. If you use a particular service or use an identity provided by a particular person, that's enough. But actually, commercially, of course, it's more than that. Trust is more than just proof. But Kirsti, do you have a view on that about whether we should actually be sort of legislating and saying, effectively making safe harbor, and ask Rainer as well after you sort of saying, government should be saying it's enough if you use this, and you'll be deemed to have an effective signature. You'll be deemed to have done your KYC. That's not the way the regulators are saying. As you were saying, Joao, it's often after the event. Or sorry, Kirsti, I think you said it's often after the event that the regulators come back and say you haven't done it well. Do you have a view on that?
Yeah, I mean, I would tend to agree that it would be easier for the obliged entities if the rules were very clear, and it would be the regulator, not only the regulator, but also the legislator telling them exactly what to do. On the other hand, we have been actually moving away from that. I mean, the last EMEA reform actually took this risk-based approach. The idea was to give more flexibility, and then the companies themselves assessing their risks and adopting due diligence measures accordingly. However, now we're in a situation where they sort of feel that they need to max them out just to be sure that they're safe from any punishments. So I think from that to me at least it seems that from the obliged entities perspective it would be good if there were at least a minimum standard. It would sort of say that now this is as a minimum, this is enough.
Rainer, what do you think as a sort of spokesman for the government here? Not engaging anybody, of course, but
actually, what Kirsti is telling is true. And if you look into the poll currently, and I see that there is 61% companies are saying that the cost of KYC have been unnecessarily high, and I think the rest who are saying they are not. I think we haven't had a visit from FIU, Financial Investigation Unit, who will say that you're not doing enough or you're doing it wrongly. So if you do it in a way as it should be done, and as was mentioned before, your cost will be very high, because actually the cost for KYC and AML is the highest cost of every financial institution and company. So if you're doing it properly, you're spending a lot of money for that process. So in real life, in paper, something might be easy. In real life, it's much more complicated.
Yeah, and because it's not just the law, as we're saying, it's all about really, do you trust these people, sort of commercially? I mean, so Mark, you're probably somewhere in between the two as a private provider. What's your view on this question?
So sorry, can you?
So the question is, do you think that government should legislate and effectively give a requirement and say if you do this, you don't need to do anything more, you'll have been deemed, you'll have accepted to comply with the law. It's what the Americans call a safe harbor. You do this, you get this piece of paper, that's it, no more liability. Or do you think it's something that should be more flexible? That seems to be certainly the view that the EU is taking in development of standards, and use a private provider.
Definitely more flexible. So we have heard the word risk-based approach coming up more and more in regulations as well. And I think a word to also take into consideration here is risk appetite. So where am I operating? How does the landscape of the data, like what kind of data can I get from that country? So you have to take that into consideration and build your own guidelines and ways of working. And it would be very difficult to have the law saying you have to do this exactly this way if we want to be in a...
The man from the government is agreeing with you there.
Yes, and if you allow me, I'll later give you an example and telling about this a bit more. The language, as I was talking before, and what we actually did or doing currently in Estonia is to try to give the data that is standardized. So, because you know that the government has a lot of data about you. Depending on the government, how to be collected, but anyway, the data that government has is usually rather qualified. It means it might be not in the correct data about you, but at least it's collected and it has some
quality control.
Quality control inside it, and it's trusted. And in one hand, if you put this data in a format that is receivable, and you try to help to put it in some kind of, like, let's say, the form or data set, at least it gives everybody the possibility to access the data and to analyze it. So, because currently, as a companies in every way doing by collecting this information from different databases. So we run in between of databases, collecting it. Mostly we get it out in PDF, or in some cases we just see it on the screen. But we need to get this information for doing risk analysis in the computer, because FEU is coming and saying, please show that you did the check. So what we're doing, we print the screens. So we call it the print internet out in the paper. So we print the screens, and then we manually enter the data to the computer back. So what happens is that it takes a lot of time, and every company does it differently. And if you go, for example, today to real estate office, according to the legislation, they are e-identities. They mostly don't know about it, but they have to do it. If you go to notary, you will send the same information again and again. And so in one fact, you are doing it again and again, and everybody is collecting the information. But if you make this information available some way, somehow, that will, from a state side, if you have that information, why do not make it available if you have it?
Yeah.
So because we do think that the information about myself as a subject of the data is my information, it's not the state information. So if the protection state is saying that this is mine, I don't give it out. But this is wrong, because this is my information, I should have access to it, and I should give access to it. So currently what we are doing in Estonia to give access to that information and to make the access available in some logical way.
Yes.
For example, if you make the risk assessment by accessing some level of trusted information, you can decide, do you have to do some different processes for checking the person background, or is it person so clear and there is no risk that you can go further with that? So at least to give this information, because otherwise what happens, the companies are spending a lot of money. Actually, a few years ago, we calculated in Estonia that the cost for making the KYC, not the AML, only the KYC is the first on the line of all the EML, is around 40 million euros a year, and we have, small country. So you can imagine how much this money is in a scale of the world of the European Union, and how that 40 million is coming is main cost are the cost of this data collecting. So a person is doing in manual in a way, going to one another register, checking it, when scanning it, when asking the questions, when doing something. And this 40 million can be reduced if this information is made available, and in most cases, if it's made available in a machine-readable way in real time. So we are currently building a system that allows to access this data in machine-readable way. And for example, if the company is receiving this email, not email, but receiving this data in machine-readable way, yesterday Sandra was showing it how we have a system we are building, this information can be sent. And if through the consent management, this information is able to access directly. So, for example, in your bookkeeping company or in your business management company, you all get information already in the computer. You don't have to do anything. As a client manager, as a company owner, you just look at the information and you have already some maybe pre-analysis done. So you know the risk, maybe there is some kind of traffic light already put on, but you know, this information must be checked again.
Okay, so I'm just going to stop you there because we're actually, we don't have any questions yet. Joao, you make a comment, and then I'm just asked the audience has a question, because we spent a lot of time on this, but I think it's really important because it is a shifting landscape, and it's a really important one. Joao.
Yeah, I just wanted to build on what Rainer was saying. I think this is going to be crucial. On the one hand, it is the API infrastructure that allows a lot of this data that is now currently somewhere to be opened up and consumed in a much more sustainable way, so it doesn't take all this time. So it does lower the cost. I think that's fundamental. And the other thing is that I think it touches upon what you brought in the beginning, which is this verifiable credentials, where data ownership is crucial. We are all aware of it. GDPR has hammered that into our heads every time we go to some new website. But the fact that if I have this electronic identity, and we know that because we aggregate all these different electronic identities, and you were talking about France. I hope there's no French people in the audience, but let's hammer them as well. We are not allowed to read the data from the French ID card. Even though we can, technically it's possible, only the police and border guard can do that. And so they have a very, very sensitive privacy law.
Yeah.
The Germans are also very sensitive about this unique identifiers, as you mentioned it. So I think with this verifiable credential, what we'll see is that it will be permissions-based. It will be, me giving the permissions, that if a website needs to know how old I am, that's what I'm giving them access to. Not even my age, whether I'm above 18 or below 18. If they need to know my gender for whatever reason, I can give them that. If they need to know my address, if they need to know my, if I'm a politically exposed person, if they need to know all of these things, they can get permission-based access to some of the information that the state has about me or one of these trust providers has about me. So I think this is where we're going to see some evolution in the future, with APIs being built around data that already exists and permissions-based about the data that they need access to.
Yeah, and I'll just read from the UN CFAT report. So talking about decentralized identifiers, exactly what it is. What is a decentralized identifier? It's an identity as determined by the controller of the identity, i.e., the issue. So this, it's permissioned, as Sandra said very well yesterday. It's permissioned. It's need to know. Can
I add one thing?
Yes, quickly.
Are we going to discuss with Joao? Actually, this permission to use the data and see the data is actually the new step ahead, because so far most of things have been done is register or whatever information public accessible or not, or do you keep it in your way? But if you're doing it in a consent manager, this is the thing that, for example, in Facebook or Instagram or Apple, you're giving your accessing to new services. You just push use, or Google, for example, use my account, and they are you can access to new services by the consent. Mm-hmm. So this is the new step actually that can be used also not only in the private services, but also the public services, and to access the data and to share the data. And we are currently in a phase, for example, we can give a very close example. In Estonia, the social security code, your ID code, is open data. Everybody can see it and use it. But for example, according to this code, you can see where the person is born. So you can see how old he is, and you can also see his gender, male or female. So it gives you information because it's standardized. But for example, in Latvia, our neighbors, they made the code, they changed the law, and now the code is made in a way that you can treat nothing from a code. You don't see the personal date of birth, you don't see the gender, so this information is not anymore available.
But I don't know what your take is on that. Is it that you think it should be done the Estonian way, or what the Latvians are doing?
No, actually, I'm saying that if this information in some way made easier, but in some way not, or in French you are not even allowed to see information because it's secured, there should be a mechanism.
Because until now, I think it was Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania were the only countries that were very open with their ID number and publishing it there.
And now in Latvia you have both ID codes now, the old ones and new ones, and Lithuania is the same as in Estonia, exactly the same structure of a code.
But if you go to, and I think it has to do also with the culture of openness or not, whether your tax information should be made public or not, but you start to see more and more these electronic identities not making your ID code public, so having a unique identifier that is detached from the ID code, and then having those date of birth and gender as separate fields that you can get access to outside of the ID number.
Yeah, but when you have that, the consent is very important, that you keep a consent, somebody to access. It's not in a way that is done background, secretly, so you don't know what somebody's checking. You know what you have, keep a consent, or in otherwise you can always check that somebody has used your information. So this is important as well, that it's monitored, how it's used the data. And as Sandra was telling yesterday as well, you have to be able to understand why this police was checking the information. Is a connection, not like a misusing the information, because this is the question of trust in UK, for example, because the companies or the people are not trusting the state, why he's using information. Maybe he's using for some kind of surveillance. Maybe he wants to penalize me for some reason.
That's certainly being a big issue in the UK.
So that's the trust of questions, and you have to know that they will check my information, and you have to be a possibility to ask, why did you should do it?
Yeah, I mean, I suppose there's two sides, because there's a lot of worry, of course, about things like identity theft, and of course we know that that is a problem, I guess just from a private perspective, not from a company perspective, but actually making some of these digital identities publicly available is potentially could be problematic. So there's obviously a halfway house. I'm surprised I haven't had any questions on it, because I think we spent a lot of time on this area, because I think it's really interesting. It's developing. There are different concepts here. There are people, there are governments getting involved, making it better. But as we've heard today and yesterday, actually, there's a whole network that needs to. And this discussion, by the way, about the Baltic countries, not even all three of them, sort of, Estonia and Latvia being a little bit. Was Lithuania in there as well? Or yeah. So the Baltics being sort of quite open with digital IDs, but the French and the Germans being very different. It is. I consider myself a European. I would like to think that actually at least we have some unity in the countries that are left in the EU. It doesn't always seem to be the case. Do we have any questions on this? Because I think it's a really fascinating area, and you've got great, Dominic. There's one there. You might. You might want to. You might. I anticipate you might want to ask a question about security, but maybe not.
Let me give you the microphone as well as the live stream. Hi. Sean, I've got a question. Well, interested on the panel's view on the following. I mean, the subtle distinction between proof of identity, either at corporate or individual level, of which there's been some great discussion and great points made this morning, and proof of signature. So if one relates that to our business in trade, of course, annually and upon onboarding a client, one needs to prove identity both at the individual level, ownership level, and at the corporate level. But I've struggle to see how qualified electronic signatures actually help at the transactional level, because at that point, you're actually more interested in knowing that an approved individual within the company, which might not technically be the signatory, has authorized that particular transaction.
Yes, so this is about, so thank you for raising that to that point, and I'll ask our lawyer firstly what you think about that. So this is, so the question here is around what's the authority behind the digital signature, which maybe has been verified to the very highest standards. What is and Joao, I'm sure you'll have a view on this as well, what is the quality of that person's authority? Do we know, has there been a company resolution and so on? How do you deal with that? And I'll come to you, Kirsti, first on that.
Well, in Estonia, it's super simple. I mean, it's all publicly available, and it's easy for you to check from the company's register. I understand it's not the case in elsewhere in the EU maybe, but yeah, here it should be super simple. But we were discussing just earlier that it's. While it is publicly available, free, etc., easily accessible, many companies still don't do that.
Yeah.
So, but I guess there's not much you can do about that. It's their own risk. But yeah, that's it.
I mean, maybe part of the answer to that actually is in a country that is not as efficiently and well organized as Estonia, that actually there is another level of due diligence that you still need to do, which is what are these board resolutions? And in the UK, I know that's often the case. There are concepts like ostensible authority. If somebody is a director, for example, registered in the company's registry, they're sort of deemed to have authority. You don't, of course, always deal with a director. If you're dealing with a big company, you're not going to get the director of BP, for example, signing off on your confirmation. Mark, Rainer, do you have an answer to that or a view on that?
From Estonia side, actually, we have one very different example. In Estonia, we use it's according to the law. It's called. Format readable re-performance, kirjalik taasesitamist võimaldav vorm. So actually you can even send power of attorney just sending an email or SMS.
Right.
According to the law and according to the core, this is a valid proof of this person can sign the document.
Yeah, so you got that
yes,
background
because
level.
you can reuse it, you can show it, it's on an email or in an SMS, so you can reuse it and so you can show that was our authority. I don't know other countries when these kind of things are accepted, and it's according to the law, you can use it.
Yes, and it's
the same as signature, same power almost.
But Mark, what sort of, to deal with that sort of issue that Dominic raised, what do you do to sort of verify authorities? Do you do that as part of the service you offer?
So what I would say that is if it's possible for them to sign via eID, I definitely see that as a very, very important and good thing to do. That will reduce the KYC times very, very much, and it will reduce the cost. It will give the companies faster time to revenue. Definitely. But important takeaway here is that we are in a global world now, and that every country and every person that needs to be identified cannot be that through eID today. And again, it's important that the laws enables companies to have this risk-based approach. So for a very big company, it can be impossible to get the CEO to sign a signature on a contract, etc. So the law have to support the businesses to do that kind of assessment. So what is okay?
Okay, yeah. This is the regulators playing fair by us, but against the background of this much better technological provision that we have. And I think it's for your point about if there is a QES, you've got the, Joao, you mentioned at the beginning, you've got the actual, the trust service provider that's done his background work. I'm not sure whether they do look at things like corporate authorities.
No. And I think here, to answer the question in terms of the liability is outsourced to the trust service provider regarding the verification of identity of the person or the signature. So the verification of the signature is there with the trust service provider, and therefore the liability is with the trust service provider. Okay. Whether that person is authorized to sign something, that doesn't come with the QES. So you have two options. Either it is part of your process when you're negotiating the deal, making sure you're negotiating with the right person that has the authority to then sign this. And this is, if you're doing a multi-million euro deal, perhaps by that stage you already know who you're dealing with, and you just want to make sure that, yes, this person is signing it. Or if that's not the case, then there are some initiatives, I mean, here in Estonia, obviously, but there are some initiatives in the Nordic countries about making sure that, at least in Norway and I think in Sweden, that there is a cross-check between company registries and who is the person in, is it in the board, is it authorized to sign what type of documents. So there are some initiatives, it's not widespread yet across the world, but these things will become more widespread once we understand the benefits and once more, let's face it, why are we here at this conference? We're at this conference because we believe in a globalized economic system, and more of these transactions globally happening will require more of adoption of these types of technologies. So I think we'll see that in the
that's a really important point you've made, of course. That, I mean, here we're fortunate being in the Baltics, where it's all it's a very unified and trusting society. But we need, trade is cross-border, and there are different standards, and I think it's sort of it's also a call to the regulators and the legislators to say, look, we've got this great technology now. We can do better. But you've got to help us a little bit because we're never going to get 100%, I suppose, proof. I mean, it's a bit like Sandra was saying about getting married digitally here. You still have to turn up, which is maybe good because I mean, part of the reason I think she mentioned it's to do with human trafficking. I mean, we know that marriages can be misused by and so on. So there's always going to be a human element, and I think that's great. We're not going to be replaced by robots.
No,
so that's good.
Hopefully
Whatever Elon Musk might think. Any more questions on this? And then I just want to, we've sort of touched on it already, I think. But so we talked about the products. We talked about maybe how the legislators and the regulators can help. But the delivery, we've also sort of touched on it. I mean, the title of this panel is about APIs. But can you say, is our APIs the best way of doing this? What about things like wallets? So there are personal wallets, corporate wallets, I think are developing, the registries, e-citizenship. Let's not talk about that because that's more on the private side, but sure.
Yeah, I think APIs obviously are going to make the cost of adopting this from a business perspective much lower, and the interoperability, I think, there is key. But at the end of the day, it is up to the adoption and the uptake from the citizens, from people and companies to do that. And I think the wallets will have a transformative effect there. You already start to see Apple, Google playing their cards in the US and maybe trying to make their way into Europe. I'm not entirely sure what the European Union is going to look at.
Can you just explain actually for me, maybe for the audience as well, the difference between an API approach and a wallet approach? Or is there no real difference?
It's not that it's a different approach. I think where the API comes to play is in what Rainer's example was, which is to make sure that the data that is kept somewhere can communicate with other systems through this API, right? So that if I'm being onboarded, I can easily say, okay, my data about me is somewhere, so you can communicate through this API and access this data. The wallet is more of the end user. So the usability of the data, yes. So this is where I think it is going to have, the adoption is going to be because of the wallets. And again, I think Apple and Google, no matter what the European Union will say, and I think the European Union will be quite skeptical about American companies having a big role in the European wallets. As soon as Apple gets 2 or 3 countries in Europe to play along with them, there's going to be a domino effect. And they don't need a lot of countries. I think if they get a few more open countries, then the users will see the benefits, the adoption will start growing, and you'll see other countries falling in line.
And I think that's right. That's the prize that's worth pursuing. I mean, prior to talk about wallets and APIs, there's been efforts by a number of people to create registries, KYC registries. So people like the ICC tried to do that. Afrexim Bank have tried to do that in Africa. I think are still trying to do it. They've met with very limited success. I think partly because they're a sort of highly centralized approach.
The Singapore example, for example, Singapore who wanted to build a huge system and actually they put in a shelf a few years ago the same thing, that the register to build up something from a zero is just enormously expensive.
Yeah.
And we have to actually think in one way also the risk of building up a new register for KYC, for example, whatever data, if it's a private register, and what happens if the register comes in the hand of some terrorist country or somebody who is not very Europe or Western world friendly by this company who has that register, and when he access that huge amount of data about everybody. And that's actually another risk that also need to be always dealt with. That, for example, we in Estonia think that we don't need to build up another register. So let's use these APIs and just collect the data. It's in real time.
Yeah.
And if you have some wallet, it also means that this wallet should be secure, and you have to be sure that nobody can access the wallet. And if somebody is buying, for example, Apple, let's say it's some country from Asia, so can I be sure that my data is not used on any other purposes? If the control is not anymore in some democratic or that way understandable word. So that's an issue as well.
Yeah.
And I think that should be not only European Union, but all the countries think of giving access of some player that is private and that can be easily changed or bought out, and you might be not having the control of the data. The issue we had with one Chinese mobile company providing the same issue actually.
Yeah, the manufacturer of my phone here.
Yeah.
And if they're listening to it, they're able to track our Q&A. Still no questions here, but maybe some from the audience. Mark, so how does this sort of API wallet, how does that factor into the sort of services that you offer? Do you look at all these things and offer all of them, or how does it work?
So API is a very, very important part of our offering. Our model is that we take in data from all over the world, from official registers, but also data that we can find online, annual reports, etc. And we offer that data as an API into different, it could be CRM systems or whatever system that the customer wants to implement this information in. And what it helps with is, as an example, quicker time to complete the KYC. We had a very recent case with a customer that used the API, and the API spoke to their billing program and stopped a payment that was, and it was related to sanctions. So very important part of our offering, and it can do a lot.
And that all happened automatically, seamlessly, just through the system itself.
Yes.
Without any need for really human intervention at the detection stage at the beginning. Yeah.
So without that kind of technology, maybe that payment would have gone through, and then we would have a very, very serious event there. Yeah.
Okay, great. Any question, Jim?
Thank you, Sean. I have a question for Rainer. Still on the KYC theme. You mentioned that KYC alone is costing Estonian businesses 40 million euros per annum. And even with the systems that we have, but they're not yet fully machine-readable solutions. When machine-readable solutions roll out fully, how much do you anticipate that 40 million figure for KYC to drop? And how might that scale across the EU?
That's a very quick question, actually. And the idea is that to give example, because if I've mentioned about Singapore, and there is some project called Nordic KYC as well. And Nordic KYC was, as an example, should be example of good cooperation in between of countries of Nordic big banks. But actually this project has not been very successful. They only exchanged few data. So the idea is to show, for example, if this that we are building up currently is going to really do work and is in use, and the data is machine readable, but giving access to automatization in the future, when we can prove to other countries that this kind of system works. Because what is the main question about belief of the trust? So you asking, can you trust the state? Somebody asking, can you trust the data? And if you show that this can be used in real life and is going to work, and the new services are built up on that, then it's like the scalability in European Union, and all the companies can see that this is something that can be used, and ask, wait, government, could we get access to the data? Could you give us the data? Because the data in the registers is machine readable, but for some reason the data is given out on PDFs, not in machine readable way. So that's the real life in all around Europe, and also in most cases in Estonia. So inside of a system it's all fine, but you can't give it out. So you only need to make this data available, and once you make it available, when the new services who help companies to build a new KYC, AML, whatever risk analysis are getting much more used, and they reduce the cost, because the costs are very high for the KYC. And if in the European Union, it's actually a multi-billion euros market. And to reduce it at least a bit, every company has an interest in that.
Yeah, I mean, there's also private costs here. I think the cost in my own bank, the cost of KYCing a customer, just normal KYC, is around $40,000. So more efficient, it would save that. Those are private savings. We've run out of time, but is there a burning question from the audience? I think we covered some really interesting stuff here. Otherwise, I will just ask our panelists just to say one final thing. What's going to be the next big thing in digital identities? eIDAS 2 is going to empower us. What's the next big thing?
I think right now...
Or next big issue?
Yeah, I think right now the next big thing is this, as we talked a little bit during the panel, this tension between the levels. You know, do we need to have this level of assurance high at all times, or is the level of assurance substantial enough for the eIDs?
Okay, I'll stop you there.
Okay.
Kirsti?
From legal side, I'd say it's options like the one that the Estonian state is offering for companies, obliged entities to mitigate the regulatory risks are very welcome.
Yeah.
But as options, not as obligations.
As options, yes. A lot of flexibility. Rainer?
I think the future is free of charge KYC services. I'm sorry for the companies who are providing these services currently, and for a very high price. I know 135 euros is the cost for
free of charge.
KYC.
I love that word, yes.
Yes, so I think this is the future.
Okay. Mark, you're not free of charge.
So, yeah, I would agree with Joao then. Yeah, I think my colleagues here in this panelist explained that very well. So,
okay. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you very much, panelists. Thank you for the audience. That's it. That's a wrap. Thank you.
Thank you.